So hello and welcome to yet another episode of Biographics. I'm your interim host, Carl Smallwood. Yes, that is my real name, and today we're talking about Charles Pretty Boy Floyd, America's Robin Hood outlaw. And as with all the videos here at Biographics, this one is based on original scripts submitted to us by a member of our writing team, that being Radu Alexander, who you can follow at the social media links below. And while you're down there, why not leave a like, a comment with feedback or suggestions, and subscribe to the channel. Normally we'd say that after the video because that's where it makes the most sense, but analytics show that me saying it before the video means all three of those things are more likely to happen because I don't know, YouTube's weird about that, I guess. If you'll gather round me, children, a story I will tell about Pretty Boy Floyd, an outlaw. Oklahoma knew him well. Yes, he took to trees and timber to live a life of shame. Every crime in Oklahoma was added to his name, but many a starving farmer, the same old story told, the outlaw paid their mortgage and saved their little homes. Others tell you about a stranger that came to have a meal. Underneath his napkin, he left a $1,000 bill. Those words come from the Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd, a song by American folk icon Woody Guthrie. It perfectly encapsulates the complex and controversial legacy left behind by one of America's most notorious outlaws. Pretty Boy Floyd was a robber and a killer, there's no doubt about that. He actually became the country's new public enemy #1 after the death of John Dillinger. And yet, to many people, he's remembered as the so-called Robin Hood of Cookson Hills for his generosity towards the needy, and most famously for allegedly burning mortgage documents whenever he robbed a bank to get people out of debt. But was this reputation deserved, or did Floyd simply benefit from some good old-fashioned post-mortem PR? Let's find out, shall we? Charles Arthur Floyd was born on February 3rd, 1904, that's the day after my birthday, in Adairsville, Bartow County, Georgia, the fourth of 8 children of Walter Lee Floyd and Mammy Helena Coles. His father first worked as a railroad fireman and then as a miner until he found his calling as a farmer. In 1911, the family packed up their bags and moved to Hanson, Oklahoma, where they grew crops on a little plot of land. The Floyds lived on the southern edge of Cookson Hills, a large area covered in thick underbrush with few poorly maintained roads to get around. It had a reputation of being a favoured hiding spot for people in trouble with the law, and many a famed outlaw found refuge in the Cookson Hills. Growing up, young Charles heard the stories of infamous ne'er-do-wells such as Bill Doolin, Belle Starr, and the Dalton Gang, who all passed through the Cookson Hills at one point or another. In particular, though, young Floyd became particularly fascinated with the exploits of a Kansas criminal named Eddie Adams, who wound up in those parts after executing a daring escape while being taken to prison by train. After a few years in Hanson, the family moved to a bigger farm near Aikens, where the Floyd grew their own food and their own livestock. They also made their own cornmeal, lard, soap, and other items using food byproducts, and soon enough, Walter opened a general store in Atkins to sell extra goods. Overall, Charlie, as his family called him, had a pretty happy childhood. He was described as being a friendly, outgoing boy who was fun to be around, who loved and respected both his parents and was protective of his siblings. There were just 2 issues with him though. One, he wasn't exactly the valedictorian material. Once he knew how to read and write and do some basic arithmetic, he was like, I'm done, that's enough for me, and left school in the 6th grade. And the other issue is that Floyd really didn't like hard work, and he did do hard work because he was told, but he never really saw it as his future. And Charlie began drifting down a darker path as a teenager. He started quite small, as most career criminals do, with some fights and some minor petty thefts. He even risked a little jail time in 1923 when the then 18-year-old Floyd was arrested for his role in a post office burglary, but lack of evidence and testimony from his respected father kept him out of the slammer, at least for now. When he wasn't getting into scrapes or trouble with the law, Charlie was only interested in one thing: girls, and they were certainly interested in him. He wasn't called Pretty Boy sarcastically or anything. Charles Floyd was a strong and handsome young man who liked to be well dressed and well groomed. His family did make soap, so that makes sense. And some say this is how he gained his famous nickname, but there are several contradicting origins for the Pretty Boy moniker. So we're not exactly sure where it started. We know one thing for sure though: Floyd hated it, but it stuck. He was hardly the only criminal that didn't like his nickname, by the way. George Nelson hated being called Babyface, and if you dared call Ben Siegel Bugsy to his face, you risked catching a beating. even a bullet. Those are all shameless plugs, by the way. We've already covered those gangsters if you're interested. Like, finish watching this video first if you still have a hankering for some true crime. They're all sitting there in the description, just waiting for you to click on and improve our analytics. So back to Floyd. Another nickname he'd had since he was a teenager was Choc, due to his fondness for Choctaw beer. He probably would have preferred everyone call him Choc Floyd, but it didn't have the same ring to it. Anyway, in 1924, the 20-year-old Floyd married a 16-year-old farm girl named Ruby Hargrave, described as having dark eyes, auburn hair, and a pretty face. They had a son named Charles Dempsey Floyd, and the three of them lived in a log cabin not far from the family home in Akins. And Charlie decided to give the whole farming thing a go, but this was not up his alley. So in 1925, Pretty Boy Floyd set off to look for, shall we say, alternative forms of income. During that year's harvest, Floyd met Fred Hildebrand, a two-gun toting hoodlum who, unlike Pretty Boy, got his own nickname, so he went by the Sheik, because he looked like Rudolph Valentino, or at least he thought he did, and who's going to argue with a guy with two guns? Hildebrand was laying low after robbing an electrical manufacturing company of over $1,800, and he told Floyd of all the easy targets the two of them could hit together and convinced him to tag along. In August 1925, Floyd got himself a revolver, kissed his family goodbye, and travelled with the Sheik down to St. Louis. That month alone, the criminal duo robbed multiple grocery stores and gas stations. In September, their ambitions grew and they robbed the payroll being distributed to a Kroger food store's headquarters. Afterwards, while talking to the press, the paymaster described Floyd as a pretty boy with apple cheeks. And this is another potential origin story for the Pretty Boy nickname. The robbery might have been a success, but Floyd and Hildebrand started spending money like there was no tomorrow. This made the police suspicious, and when the authorities picked them up for a quick chat, they found thousands of dollars in cash on them, as well as money wrappers from the bank. Floyd pled guilty and eventually was given 5 years at the Missouri State Penitentiary. His wife actually only found out about his extracurricular activities, as we're going to call them, after he was arrested when she read about them in the papers. She divorced him while he was serving out his sentence. Floyd was paroled after 3.5 years, but he had no intention of going straight. In fact, he'd made quite a few criminal connections inside prison, and when he got out, he made a beeline for Kansas City, Missouri. But before Floyd could do any serious damage, he received some quite heartbreaking news from back home. His father had been killed by a neighbour named Jim Mills during a fight over some lumber. Floyd returned to Cookson Hills for the funeral and trial, but Mills was acquitted on the grounds of self-defense. Mills mysteriously disappeared after that, and his body has never been found. Whether or not we can actually ascribe this murder to Pretty Boy Floyd, we can't say for sure, although he made it quite abundantly clear in the years that followed that he had no qualms about taking a life. So Floyd only returned to Kansas City for a short while, but it was enough to attempt to assassinate a detective named Burt Haycock, who had been causing way too many headaches for his underworld associates. Haycock survived this encounter with the outlaw, and because the detective saw his face, Floyd thought it best to find greener pastures. He joined up with a prison buddy named James Bradley and headed to Ohio. Bradley's gang first committed a series of robberies in and around Toledo. Then they moved on to Akron, where things went south quickly. While driving, Bradley accidentally crashed his car into an oncoming vehicle. As two policemen rushed to the scene, he panicked and opened fire, killing patrolman Harlan Maines. After that, the Akron Police Department was out for blood and scoured the city until every member of the gang was captured. Bradley was sentenced to death for the murder, while Floyd and the others were given 12 to 15 years for the robberies. And it looked like this would have been the end for Pretty Boy, but he escaped on the way to prison, emulating his childhood hero, Eddie Adams. During the train ride, he smuggled a handcuff key under his tongue, asked to go to the bathroom, and after uncuffing himself, broke the window and jumped out of the train. Floyd had sworn he would rather die than go back to prison, and spoilers, ultimately, he would get his wish. On the run from the law, Floyd opted for familiar surroundings and returned to Kansas City, where he reunited with a lover named Juanita Baird. He also teamed up with a ruthless outlaw named Billy the Babyface Killer Miller, a much more experienced criminal with an admittedly less cool name, already having 28 arrests and 5 murders to his name. Together, they planned a spree of robberies up and down the country. But before leaving Kansas City, there was one final matter to take care of. Miller had hooked up with Juanita's sister, Rose, after he'd left her husband William Ash, who was also a malevolent malefactor of the city's criminal classes. Allegedly, Williams and his brother Wallace ratted out Floyd and Miller to the police, trying to get them arrested or killed. Either one would have worked fine, but the outlaws managed to escape and they wanted revenge. One night, the Ash brothers were lured to a meeting by a phone call from a woman. Their car was found on fire by the side of the road a few hours later. Their bodies in a ditch next to the road, both shot in the head. No prizes for guessing who did them in. Afterwards, the foursome, Floyd, Miller, Juanita, and Rose, left town and intended to go on a rampage through Missouri, Oklahoma, Kentucky, and and Ohio. However, the team-up was short-lived and ended after only 2 bank robberies. On April 16, 1931, the gang was in Bowling Green, Ohio. The 2 men were at a barber shop while the women were doing some shopping, but someone recognized their faces and called the police. Chief of Police Gallagher and Patrolman Ralph Kastner approached the men and a shootout ensued. One shot from Gallagher ripped open Miller's neck and the gunman was dead before he hit the ground. Juanita also caught a bullet, but she made a complete recovery. Rose was captured and this only left Floyd. Confronted by Patrolman Kastner, Pretty Boy emptied his gun into him, shooting him 7 times before getting the hell out of Dodge all alone. Kastner died a week later. Following the murder, Floyd was as hot as a supernova, and even before this he gained a certain level of infamy, mainly because the papers love writing about the exploits of the pretty boy criminal who robbed banks and escaped from custody. But now he truly was one of the most notorious outlaws in the entire country. Floyd needed a place where he could lay low until the heat died down, so it was back to Kansas City for him. Pretty Boy hid in a flower shop, which is a front for a liquor business, alongside another gangster named John Callio, who was also wanted for murder. On July 20th, 1931, the police and prohibition agents raided the flower shop. Special Agent Curtis Burks had the misfortune of running into Floyd in the back room of the place. Floyd killed Burks without hesitation, then shot another 3 law enforcement agents as he was making his getaway, but they all survived their injuries. An innocent bystander was hit and killed during the shootout, and lastly, when Callio refused to surrender, he went for his gun. A policeman basically disintegrated his entire head with a point-blank shotgun blast. So yeah, overall, a pretty bloody affair, which ended with Floyd once again free and on the run on his own. With Kansas City in his rear view, Pretty Boy headed home to the Cookson Hills. So Floyd felt pretty safe in the familiar environs of Cookson Hills, but he had no intention of stopping his crime spree. There were people to be robbed. If anything, he actually accelerated it. He teamed up with a childhood friend named George Birdwell, later adding a few more members to his crew and becoming an official gang leader in his own right. Together, they committed dozens of robberies in 1931 and 1932, although the exact number of crimes the gang perpetrated is difficult to pinpoint. As noted in the song at the beginning of this video that I butchered, almost every robbery in and around Oklahoma at the time started being attributed to Pretty Boy Floyd, including those he had nothing to do with. And the papers knew that stories about the Pretty Boy would sell pretty well, so rarely did a few days go by without at least one mention of the local criminal superstar. Sometimes Floyd was accused of robbing 2 banks at the same time in cities miles apart from each other. Other times, newspapers report that Floyd would taunt the police about banks he intended to rob. For example, one in Enola, Oklahoma. One local newspaper wrote that Floyd wouldn't dare to rob that place because during the previous 5 attempts, all the criminals were either captured or killed, and Floyd supposedly wrote a letter to the police saying, "I'm going to rob that bank though." The reward on Floyd's head, due to all of these crimes, totaled some $6,000 dead or alive. There was even talk of the governor bringing in the National Guard to hunt him down. He was starting to attain almost mythical proportions in Oklahoma, with some yokels even spreading rumors that Floyd always escaped the law because he was, and I quote, immune to gunfire. He wasn't, as you'll soon enough find out. So this was also around the time that his Robin Hood persona began taking shape. The Great Depression had hit Oklahoma and hit it hard. Many people struggled to feed their families and risk foreclosure on their homes. But then Pretty Boy Floyd rode in like a hero to save them. How did he do this, you ask? Well, supposedly whenever he robbed a bank, he would destroy all of the mortgage documents to protect people from foreclosure, which sounds quite noble. The question is, did he ever actually do this? And the answer is a rather unsatisfying, we don't think so. Pretty much every solid source only describes this act of benevolence as a rumor or a legend, and even the FBI reports that Floyd might have done this once or twice, possibly by accident, but it was certainly not a usual part of his modus operandi. It's probable that Floyd did bring food for starving families from time to time or gave them money directly, but this was not a completely selfless act either. It was more a gesture of thanks for not turning him into the authorities because, as mentioned, he had a quite large bounty on his head at the time, and he knew such a reward would be awfully tempting to someone in dire straits, as most people back then were. Overall, he made a pretty poor Robin Hood, especially when you remember the whole killing people thing that he did a lot. His next victim was Special Investigator Irvin A. Kelly, a former sheriff of McIntosh County who'd been tasked with the capture of Oklahoma's most notorious criminal. And it's worth noting that killing Kelly was no simple task because he had a pretty stellar reputation, having captured 14 bank robbers and 6 murderers. During Floyd's time back in Cookson Hills, he had reunited with his ex-wife Ruby and his son. And Kelly knew that they were the perfect bait, and that if he stayed on their tail, before long, Floyd would show up, and show up he did. On April 9th, 1932, Kelly prepared an ambush outside a farmhouse a few miles west of Bixby where he believed Floyd would meet with Ruby. The lawman had 6 veteran agents and 2 deputised farmers with him, but as the hours passed and Floyd was a no-show, people were starting to get cold and hungry and just tired of being outside holding a gun. Kelly allowed his men to take a break around 3 a.m, staying behind with only the farmers. This was his first and perhaps most fatal mistake, putting his trust in untrained civilians who hid in the dark when the shooting started. Minutes later, a car pulled up with Floyd inside, submachine gun in hand. Kelly stepped in front of the vehicle and issued a warning. This was his second mistake, allowing Floyd time to surrender instead of immediately opening fire on the known criminal who shot everybody who tried to arrest him. Of course, Pretty Boy did not hesitate and immediately fired his gun, hitting Kelly 4 times. The lawman managed to squeeze off some shots, but only hit Floyd in the legs. The car sped off as Kelly collapsed to the ground and died of blood loss. The summer of 1932 was a relatively quiet one for Floyd as he laid low to let his gunshot injuries heal, but by October he had already recruited a new gang and was ready to get back to what he did best: robbing banks. The close call he had with Kelly did not deter him one bit. In fact, he was so cocky that he gave an interview to a reporter from the Oklahoma News. The Literary Digest proclaimed him Oklahoma's Bandit King in its December issue, and he even started having impersonators, by which I mean other robbers who claimed to be him during their heists. Anyway, in November of that year, Floyd's partner, George Birdwell, was shot and killed during a robbery in Boley, Oklahoma. And you'd think that Charles Pretty Boy Floyd would mourn the loss of his childhood friend, but no, not really. There were banks to rob, so he went right back to robbing more banks after finding himself a new partner. And this partner was a short, balding Texan by the name of Adam Richetti, and together they spent the first half of 1993 up to their old tricks, robbing banks. However, things took a drastic and quite violent turn in June of that year when Floyd was involved in one of the most audacious shootouts in the country's history. It became known as the Kansas City Massacre, and on June 16, 1933, an escaped outlaw called Frank Nash had been apprehended in Hot Springs, Arkansas. 3 agents were taken in by train to Kansas City, Missouri, where a team of BOI agents, that's Bureau of Investigations, the precursor to the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigations, and police officers were waiting to transport Nash to Leavenworth Penitentiary. Some of Nash's criminal buddies had other ideas, however, and planned to bust him loose. On the morning of June 17th, the train pulled into Union Railway Station. 4 officers went to meet up with the 3 already guarding Nash. They were all armed with pistols and shotguns. Together, they escorted the prisoner to a parked Chevrolet. As the agents were getting into the car, they saw movement from a nearby green Plymouth. 3 men quickly surrounded the Chevrolet, and one of them shouted, "Let them have it." At that point, all 3 opened fire with machine guns. After emptying their magazines into the car, one of them approached the vehicle and said, "They're all dead. Let's get out of here." In reality, only 5 of the 8 men were dead. The other 3 survived the attack. Frank Nash was among the dead, by the way, since he was right in the middle of the whole ordeal. So, worst escape attempts ever, I guess? In fact, the way it all went down made people think that it was never meant to be a rescue attempt in the first place, but a hit to silence Nash. According to the FBI, the 3 gunmen were Floyd, Richetti, and another guy named Vernon Miller. Miller was found dead a few months later, executed gangland style, which helped further the theory that someone was tying up loose ends regarding Nash's assassination. Although, to be fair, Miller was the kind of guy who had lots of people wanting him dead for a variety of reasons. As to Floyd and Richetti, the FBI gathered pretty solid evidence that they were the other 2 triggermen. Pretty Boy sent a postcard to the Kansas City PD denying any part in the massacre, even though he was already wanted for multiple murders and dozens of robberies. Why or how they got involved in this remains uncertain to this day, so we apologise for not being more clear in that regard. For the first time in his career, the cockiness had left Pretty Boy Floyd. There was a nationwide manhunt for him, and he felt the noose tying around his neck. Floyd and Richetti met up with Juanita and Rose Baird, who had been released from prison, and the 4 of them travelled to Buffalo, New York, rented an apartment under an assumed name, and kept a very, very low profile. 1934 was a big year for law enforcement. First, Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down in May, then in July, John Dillinger bit the big one, and then in November, Babyface Nelson was killed in a shootout. Between Dillinger and Nelson, though, it it was Floyd's time to go. In October 1934, the foursome decided to return to Oklahoma, but just a few hours into their trip, they crashed their car into a telephone pole just outside of Wellsville, Ohio. While Rose and Juanita went into town looking for a garage, local police chief Jay Fultz and a couple of officers investigate reports of two men loitering around a forest outside of town. They ran into Richetti and Floyd and a gunfight ensued. There were a few minor injuries on both sides, but no deaths, and the cops managed to capture Richetti alive, setting him up for a date with the gas chamber a few years later. Floyd, on the other hand, managed to evade authorities once again, but he was on foot and he knew that a search party would be right on his tail. He made it to East Liverpool, Ohio before the law caught up to him, and Floyd did try to hide in the woods, but the officers opened fire with pretty much everything they had at their disposal. Think that scene in Rambo First Blood, like just without the rocket launcher. And despite potentially hundreds of bullets being shot in his direction, only 2 actually hit Floyd, but they were enough to take him down. After stumbling a few yards, Floyd clutched his wounds and fell to the ground. He exchanged a few words with the officers, mostly yelling, especially twice again, before saying, "I'm done, you got me." His last words were apparently, "I'm going." And then Pretty Boy Floyd was dead. So I hope you found this video educational, informative, and entertaining. I certainly found the script to be all 3 of those things. And if you'd like to thank the script author, you can find them at the social media links linked below. You can also find my own if you want to follow me. You can also find links to follow our sister channels, Biographics and Top 10s, where I'm also serving as the interim host. Thank you to everyone for watching at home. I would appreciate it if you liked the video, left a comment with feedback, suggestions, that sort of thing, or subscribed as mentioned. But otherwise, I hope everyone out there has the day that they deserve.